One might argue that if Elira had only kept her head down and her hands to the sick, she would never have lost everything in the space of a single winter. But then again, if the Alpha King had been half as clever about his own heart as he was about his enemies, he would never have let her walk out of his gates at all. So really, the ruin of it was his fault. Every last piece of it. He would spend 3 long years learning exactly how much his fault it was. He would send riders into 4 kingdoms hunting a low-born healer with quiet hands and a plain gray cloak, and learn, slowly and at great cost, that a woman who does not wish to be found is the one thing no crown can buy. And at the cold end of all that searching, he would find her, anyway, in a place he never thought to look, wearing something he never dreamed she would wear. But that is the far end of the story, and the far end is never where the trouble begins. The trouble began, as most royal disasters do, with a woman who was simply too good at her work and a court that had never once forgiven her for being it. Elira had set 9 bones, closed a spear wound, and talked a laboring mother through the worst of a long night, all before the palace above her had so much as stirred for breakfast. The healing hall sat below the great keep, half sunk into the mountain, the way old and useful things tend to be. She was wrist-deep in a basin, scrubbing a night's work off her hands, when she felt him before she heard him. That was the trouble with a mate bond. It never once let her have the dignity of surprise. "You should be asleep," she said without turning. "So should you," said Varric. The Alpha King filled the low doorway the way he filled everything, easily, without seeming to try, and the torches leaned toward him the way living creatures did. And yet here we both are, keeping terrible hours. One might almost think we preferred each other's company to sleep. One would be a fool to say so aloud, of course. I have an excuse. Half your guard falls off the training yard by moonlight and expects me to make it right by dawn. She dried her hands on the rough cloth at her hip. You have a bed the size of a barge, and a council that would weep with joy if you used it. The council weeps at everything. It is their one great talent, and I would not rob them of it. He crossed the hall to her, and the closer he came the warmer the thread between them ran. Low and gold and unbearably tender, a thing she had spent 2 years failing to pretend she did not feel. He caught her damp hand and turned it over and pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist, right where the pulse was, so that she felt her own heart give her away against his lips. You smell of willow bark and other men's blood. It is deeply unqueenly. The word landed wrong, as it always did. Elira drew her hand back a fraction. Then, it is fortunate I am no queen. Something crossed his face, quick and frustrated, and through the bond she felt the flare of it before he shut it down. He wanted to argue. He had wanted to argue this exact argument for the better part of a year, and each time she had turned it aside the way a swordsman turns a blade, without heat, without ever quite letting it land. But a healer with no name and no house did not become Luna of the Ridgeback Pack simply because the king wished it. And they both knew whose voices in the high hall would rise loudest against her, and neither of them, this morning, had the stomach for it. "Come up with me," he said instead, softer, the fight going out of him. "The Eastern envoys arrived today. I would rather face them with you at the back of the room looking unimpressed than with the whole council fawning at the front. You keep me honest. No one else in this mountain dares. I have patience. You have Rena, who is nearly as good as you, and half as stubborn." Elira almost smiled. She let him tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, let herself lean into the broad warmth of his palm for exactly 1 breath, because in the gray hour with no one watching, she was allowed that much and no more, and she had long since learned to make a whole meal of a single breath. Then a bell rang somewhere far above them. High and formal, 3 clear notes and a pause. And 3 again, the sequence the gate wardens kept for an arrival of rank. Varric frowned upward. "That is early. My envoys are not due until the noon watch. Then your envoys are eager. My envoys are never eager. Eagerness is beneath an envoy. It is practically the first thing they teach them. But the ease had gone out of his voice, and he was already moving. And she followed him up the long stair out of the warm dark and into the cold, bright bustle of the keep, where the trouble was, at that very moment, stepping down from a lacquered carriage into the frost of the upper court. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful, deliberate and finished and meant to be looked at. Silver fox at her collar, rings on every finger, and a house crest worked in bright thread on the bodice of her gown, a crest Elira felt she ought to know and could not for her life name. And beside her, one weathered hand at her elbow like a proud father presenting a prize at market, stood Chancellor Halvard, the man who had pulled Elira out of an orphan's cot when she was 6 years old and given her a trade, a roof, and a place in the only world she had ever known. "Ah," said Halvard, catching sight of them on the steps, and he smiled, the wide, warm smile. Elira had trusted her whole life, the smile that had meant safety, since she was small enough to hide in the folds of his robe. "Your Grace, Elira, allow me to present the Lady Severine of House Oren. She will be staying with us." His eyes moved over Elira, kind as ever, mild as milk, "for quite some time, I should think." And the Lady Severine looked up at the king, and then, slowly, deliberately, at Elira. And she smiled as though she had already read the last page of a book Elira did not yet know she was living in. For 11 days, Elira told herself it was nothing. Highborn ladies came and went from the keep like weather. They wanted trade charters, or a son advanced in the guard, or simply to be seen standing near a king, young and unmated enough to be interesting. Severine of House Oren wanted something, certainly. But so did everyone who climbed the long mountain road, and Elira had watched 100 of them arrive, full of purpose, and leave again with none. She did not have time to be jealous of a woman in silver fox, and she told herself that what she felt was not jealousy at all, but the ordinary wariness any sensible person feels toward a stranger who smiles too knowingly. Varg gave her no reason to think otherwise. If anything, the bond between them ran clearer in those days than it had in months. He came down to the healing hall at odd hours, simply to sit on the end of a cot and complain about the Eastern envoys while she worked. He had brought her a book of northern remedies, copied out at absurd expense, because she had mentioned wanting it once, half a year before, and had clearly forgotten mentioning, and he had not. One night he stayed, until the candles guttered down to blue, and when he kissed her it was without any of the old careful restraint, and she felt through the thread the plain uncomplicated truth of what he felt, no mask on it at all, and it undid her more thoroughly than any words could have. "You feel that," he murmured against her jaw. It was not a question. The bond made liars of them both impossible, which was, she thought, the cruelest thing about it, and the kindest, and she had never decided which one out. "I feel it," she admitted. "Then stop telling me you are no queen." His hand spread warm across the small of her back. "I do not want a house. I do not want a crest. I want the woman who set my captain's shoulder in the mud and told me to my face I was being an idiot about the grain tithe in front of my own war council, and was right. That woman, only her. There is no version of this where I am talked out of it, so you may as well stop trying." She did not answer. She could not, without saying the thing underneath, which was that she had learned very young, in a place before Halvard she could no longer clearly remember, that the people who kept her were the people who found her useful, and the day you stopped being useful was the day you learned how a door sounds closing. Being wanted for herself alone was a thing she did not know how to hold, so she kissed him instead and let the bond say what her mouth would not. It was Rena who put the first crack in it. "You have not heard," Rena said, low, 3 mornings later, folding linens with a great deal more force than linens require. She was a wiry girl with a cook's forearms and an unmatched ear for everything whispered in a kitchen, and she had appointed herself Elira's friend some years back, without asking, which was the only way anyone ever got close to Elira at all. About the Oran woman, I have heard she takes her wine watered, and thinks our mountain air is coarse and our bread beneath her. Elira did not look up from the salve she was grinding. I have heard, said Rena, and now her hands went still on the linen, that she has been 3 times to the king's own wing after the 10th bell in the dark, and that the chancellor himself arranged the hours and told the corridor guard to see nothing. Elira's hands went still on the pestle. That is a great deal of hearing, Rena. I have a great many ears, and they do not lie to me the way people do. Rena would not meet her eyes, which was worse than if she had. Elira, I would not carry it up to you if it were only kitchen talk. Emmerich stands the night watch on that corridor. Now he let it slip to me over supper, and then went white as tallow when he understood who he was telling, and begged me to forget it. I could not forget it, so I brought it to you instead. The bond sat quiet in Elira's chest, gold and warm, and giving her nothing at all, because Varric was 2 floors up in the council chamber and had closed his side of it the way he always did when the talk turned to grain weights and tariff schedules and things he found tedious past bearing. She told herself that meant nothing. She told herself a great many sensible things, and lined them up like jars on a shelf, and did not believe a single one. That evening, she went up the back stair without quite deciding, to the way a tongue goes to a sore tooth. She told herself she was fetching the Northern Remedy book she had left in the solar. The corridor to the king's wing was dim and empty, the sconces burning low, the great keep gone quiet around her, and she was halfway along it when she heard the voices from the small antechamber where the chancellor kept his correspondence, the door not quite shut, a blade of candlelight lying across the stone. Halvard's voice, warm and reasonable, the voice that had read to her when she was small and feverish, and certain she would die before morning. It only needs to hold until the spring council. After that, it will not matter in the slightest what anyone believes. The thing will be done, and done things do not come undone, and Severine's, cool and amused, and entirely at ease. And the healer, you keep saying she is no concern. She has a king wrapped around her plain little finger, whatever you say. A pause. Elira stood very still in the dark, her hand flat against a cold stone, not breathing. The healer, said the man who had raised her, in a tone she had never once heard him use in 30 years, dry and final and faintly bored, will remove herself. Girls like that always do. It is the one genuinely useful thing about them. They know precisely when they are not wanted. They have known it since the cradle, and they save you the trouble and the mess of the knife. Elira did not sleep. She lay in her narrow room off the healing hall and turned the words over and over, and each time she turned them they cut a little deeper, because there were only so many ways to read them and none of the ways were kind. It only needs to hold. The healer will remove herself. She told herself she had misheard, that Halvard had meant some other girl in some other corridor, that the man who had carried her on his shoulders through the harvest fair when she was 7 could not possibly have said such a thing about her in such a voice. She was still telling herself things when the horns sounded for the spring council, 3 full days early, and the whole keep was summoned to the great hall, and she understood, walking up the long stair in her plain grey cloak, that she had misheard nothing at all. The great hall was full to its cold stone walls, the council on their long benches, the high houses in their winter furs, the guard along the pillars, and Varric at the head of it on the black seat of the Ridgeback Kings. Through the thin open thread of the bond she could feel him, faintly annoyed at having his mourning taken, with no warning, wary but not afraid, and she understood in a rush that turned her cold. He did not know. Whatever this was, he did not know it was coming. The chancellor had summoned the king's own court out from under the king. That single fact was the only warm thing left in the room, and it was not warm for long. Chancellor Halvard rose. He let the hall settle. He was very good at letting a hall settle, at standing in a silence until it became his silence, until every eye came to him, not because he demanded it, but because he waited, patient as a stone, for them to arrive. "Your Grace," he began, and his voice filled the vast cold room without seeming to rise. "Houses of the Ridgeback. Joy is a rare guest in a council chamber, and so, being an old man who has seen too little of it, I will not keep it waiting at the door." He turned and lifted one hand, and the Lady Séverine rose from among the high seats, with one hand laid delicately, unmistakably, across the front of her gown. "The Lady Séverine of House Oran is carrying a child, the king's child, the first blood of the next alpha of this pack. Gods be thanked for it." The hall did not gasp. It did something far worse. It murmured low and pleased, and settling the sound of a great many people who had wanted exactly this thing for a very long time, and were profoundly relieved to finally have it laid before them, an heir, a future, a certainty. And under that terrible contented murmur, Elira felt the bond in her chest lurch hard as Varric came half out of the black seat. "That is a lie." His voice cracked across the hall like a whip laid over stone, and every murmur died. Through the thread, she felt it, raw and total and instant, pure, clean shock, with not a single grain of guilt anywhere beneath it, and she knew, the way only a bonded mate can know, that he was telling the truth. He truly did not. "I have never once touched that woman. I have scarcely spoken 10 words to her. Whatever game is being played in my own hall, Chancellor, you will end it now, this instant, before it goes one word further." "A man says a great many things," Halvard said gently, sorrowfully, turning his answer to the hall rather than to the king, as if the king were a grieving relative to be managed rather than his sovereign, when an inconvenient truth arrives at an hour he did not choose. "We must not judge him too harshly for it. It is only nature." And the hall murmured again, and this time Elira heard, with a lurch of horror, it was not on the king's side. She watched Varric understand it in the same instant she did, watched him understand that he was young and new to his own power, and cornered, and that the man who had ruled this pack in all but name since before Varric could walk had just laid a trap so smoothly that the jaws were already closed before anyone saw the iron. But Elira could see one edge of it. She was a healer. She had sat with more laboring mothers than she could count, had learned to read a woman's body the way scholars read dead languages. And she was looking now at the Lady Séverine with a healer's cold and unimpressed eyes, at the too smooth line of that gown, pressed flat under that delicate hand, at the way she stood square and easy, without the particular careful balance of a woman whose center has begun, however slightly, to shift. 11 days. Séverine had been inside these walls 11 days, and there was no woman alive in any kingdom under the moon who could show the world she carried a child at 11 days. The timing was not merely unlikely. It was flatly, provably impossible. The whole gleaming edifice was built on a lie so brazen that only a hall that badly wanted to believe it ever could. And this hall, she saw, wanted to believe it very badly indeed. Elira opened her mouth to say so. And Halvard, without turning, without so much as glancing in her direction, as though he had known precisely where in the crowd she stood the entire time and had been saving her for last, said, "And the king's own healer, of course, will confirm the lady's happy condition for us. Will you not, my dear? You, whom I raised up out of nothing with my own 2 hands, you would never stand in my hall and call me a liar." Every face in the great hall turned all at once to find her. Every face in the great hall turned to find her, and for the space of one long breath, Elira understood exactly how a fox feels in the last quiet moment before the hounds are loosed. She had 2 paths, and she saw them both at once. The way she saw the 2 clean ways to set a badly broken arm. She could tell the truth that no woman on earth shows a child at 11 days, that the lady's condition was a fiction, that the kind old man who raised her was lying through his gentle teeth, and she would be believed by no one. She was a nameless healer, and he was the chancellor. The whole mountain leaned on, and the hall had already chosen which story it preferred. Halvard had not called on her because he needed her word. He needed her ruin, public and her own, dressed up as a kindness from the girl he had saved. Or she could refuse, and call her guardian a liar before the court, and be broken for it, quietly, in exactly the way he had promised the lady in the dark. He had built her a cage, with a single door, and painted the word mercy on the lock, and he was holding it open for her now, with that same warm and dreadful smile. Through the bond, she felt Varric reaching for her, not with his hands, but with the thread itself, a desperate wordless pressure. Wait, trust me, say nothing, let me. And under his fury, she felt the first cold creeping edge of his fear, because he could already see that whatever she said next, the jaws had closed on both of them together. So Elira did the only thing left in the whole trap that was still hers to choose. She lied by telling a smaller truth. "I cannot confirm what I have not examined," she said, and her voice came out level and clear, and steadier than she had any mortal right to expect. No healer worth her jars would. A hand laid on a gown tells no one anything. Give me the lady in a quiet room, in private, as is proper, and 3 days to be certain, and I will come back to this hall and tell you all exactly what is true. It was the correct answer, and it was unassailable. Halvard's eyes found hers across the crowd, and she watched him weigh it, and decide that 3 days cost him nothing, when the outcome was already carved. Wisely and modestly spoken, he said warmly, spreading his hands as if to say, "You see what a treasure I made of her. In 3 days then. Truth keeps." She did not have 3 days. She had until the corridors emptied, and they were emptying already. She went back down to the healing hall, and she did not run, because a running woman is a woman remembered. She rolled her good knives into their leather, and she took the Book of Northern Remedies, because Varric had given it to her, and she could not make her hands leave it on the shelf. And last, from the bottom of her one small chest, she took the thing she never showed anyone, the scrap of worn cloth she had been found wrapped in as an infant. A crest worked into one corner in thread gone brown, a device she had never learned to read because Halvard, when she was small and asked, had told her it meant nothing. She had kept it anyway. She sewed it that night into the lining of her gray cloak, and she did not yet understand that she was carrying her whole true name out the gate stitched over her own heart. She stood one moment in the warm dark that had been the only home she ever chose, and pressed her hand flat to her chest where the bond sat gold and aching, and did the cruelest thing she knew how to do. She closed it. She shut the door on him from the inside, the way you bank a fire you do not mean to feed again, and felt his startled grief flare once against the far side of the wall, before the silence came down between them, like a stone lid over a well. Rena found her at the postern gate, with the mountain wind coming up cold and black off the valley. "You are not even going to make him say it to your face," Rena said. "If I face him, I will believe him." Elira pulled the gray hood up over her hair, and believing him is exactly how a girl like me ends up dead in a quiet room with a healer to swear it was a fever. I was wanted for my hands. Rena, I forgot that for a little while. I will not make that mistake twice. He loves you. Anyone with eyes can see it. The whole keep can see it. The whole keep can see a great many things that are about to stop being true by morning. She caught the girl's arm hard. Just once. Tell no one which road I took. Not the guard, not the council, not him. Especially not him. Swear it to me. Rena swore it, weeping, and Elira went down the mountain in the dark, alone, and by the time the horns sounded her name across the keep at dawn, the healer with the quiet hands was 3 valleys gone and had already, mile by cold mile, begun to become someone else entirely. She did not see Varric tear that quiet room apart 3 days later and find it empty. She did not watch the lady's certainty crack when no swelling came and no child quickened, and the lie began to rot in the open air. She did not know that within the month the fiction had collapsed, that Severine of House Arin had fled the mountain in disgrace, and that the trap had sprung shut in the end, on empty air. She did not know that she had won. And she did not know that she had lost everything in the winning of it, and fled a victory she would not learn of for 3 long years. And she did not know the one thing that would have changed all of it. That her guardian had not chosen her from an orphan's cot by chance. That the crest on the blanket she was found in, the very scrap now sewn over her heart, was one Halvard had recognized at a glance, and then spent 30 years making certain she never learned to read. He had not raised her out of kindness. He had raised her to keep her small, and near, and nameless, because a nameless healer was a threat to no one, and the girl she truly was, if she ever learned her own name, was the single soul alive who could take from him everything he had built. Elira went down the mountain that night, believing she was no one at all. She was wrong. And so, for the first time in 30 years, was he. 3 years is long enough to bury a woman and grow a different one in the same cold ground. The writers Vark sent came back empty-handed, season after season, because they were all of them looking for a healer, and healers are common as rain, and the woman he had lost had stopped being won before the first snow of that year had melted from the passes. She had gone west along the trade roads, mending as she went to earn her bread, and then north, and then further north still, past the last of the maps the Ridgeback bothered to keep, up into the high broken country where the old bloodlines had gone, to ground generations back, and the pack still spoke names the soft southern kingdoms had let themselves forget. It was in a snowbound village under the shadow of the Highfell peaks that a dying woman, an old wise woman, with milk-blind eyes and a grip like a hawk's foot, had reached out from her deathbed as Elira leaned close to ease her breathing and caught the edge of the gray cloak and felt the worn scrap stitched into its lining. And then the old woman had turned those blind eyes up toward a face she could not see, and traced the raised thread of that crest, and spoken a name. A name Elira had never heard in her life, and would never, from that hour, be free of again. What came after took the better part of 3 years, and none of it came easy. A crest is not a crown. The old houses of the north remembered the line of Thoska with awe and with fear, and they did not kneel to a stranger in a grey cloak on the strength of a dead woman's word. They tested her instead. They set her the disputes no one had settled in a generation, the blood debts and the boundary stones, and the 2 proud families who had not shared a fire in 90 years, and one by one, she untangled them. They watched to see whether she would run when the first hard winter closed the passes, and she did not run. Twice someone came for the pretender in the dark, and twice she was still standing come morning. By the time they set the pale gold circlet on her brow, it was not a gift, and not an inheritance, it was a thing she had taken, slowly, until even the ones who had sworn she was nothing could no longer find a way to say so. But that is a tale of its own, and the king did not know it, and he knew no part of it on the grey morning 3 winters later when he rode north at the head of a small, hard company to answer a summons no Ridgeback king had received in 4 living generations. The Queen of the Highfells had opened her sealed borders to the southern packs, for the first time since her grandmother's grandmother sat the pale throne. She would treat for trade, for passage through the northern passes, and for a common alliance against the raiders bleeding both their lands white. And she had asked, by name, in her own hand, for the young Alpha King of the Ridgeback to come himself, and to come soon. Varric went because his council begged him to on their knees, a trade road through the north being worth more than any 3 southern provinces, and he went because, if he was honest in the small hours, he no longer greatly cared where in the world his body happened to be. He had become, over 3 years, very good at his work and very bad at everything else. He had never taken a mate, had never let the council so much as raise the subject, because the thread in his chest had gone dark and silent the night she closed it against him, and had never once flickered back to so much as a coal. And a man does not marry with another woman's severed bond lying cold and unmourned inside his own ribs. The great hall of the Highfells was carved straight from the pale stone of the mountain, and hung with the grim gray banners of a people who had survived 400 years by the simple method of being harder than the rock they lived on. Beric walked its long length with his company at his back and his crown of black iron heavy on his brow, and he did not look at the throne at the far end until protocol forced him to, because looking at other people's thrones had stopped meaning anything to him a long time ago. Then he looked, and the whole world tilted, very slowly, very gently, sideways under his feet. She sat the high seat of the Highfells the way she had once stood at the back of his own council chamber, straight-backed and unimpressed. 3 hard years had honed her the way a whetstone hones a blade. The plain gray cloak was gone, and in its place she wore the deep storm color of the northern queens, and on her brow sat a circlet of pale worked gold in a pattern he half knew and could not for his life place. Her hands, those quiet, clever healer's hands, rested still and easy on the arms of the pale throne. And her face, when at last it found his, across the length of that cold, bright hall, gave away precisely nothing at all, because she had spent 3 years learning to close far harder things than a bond. The herald's staff struck the stone floor twice, and his voice rang out across the hall, and it said, the thing that stopped the breath, dead in Varric's chest, Her Grace Elira, of the line of Vasca, Queen of the Highfells, Warden of the Northern Reach, last daughter of the old blood, and the rightful crown these mountains waited 4 generations to see returned. And the bond in Varric's chest, dark and silent and mourned for 3 long years, came awake all at once, without warning, like a great bell struck a single ringing blow in an empty tower. She felt it wake in her too. Of course she did. She had known she would, and known it for weeks, from the very hour her spymaster laid the southern reply on her desk, and she read the name of the king who would answer her summons in person, and had to set both hands flat on the wood to keep them from shaking. She had spent the whole long ride down from her own high fastness, preparing herself for exactly this moment, and none of the rehearsing was worth a single clipped copper, the instant his pale eyes found hers across the hall. It flared wide open on his side, all of it at once, with no guard on it whatsoever. 3 years of grief and searching and starved, stubborn hope came pouring across the bond toward her in one drowning wave, and Elira sat very still on the high seat of her mother's and did not let one flicker of it reach her face. She had a queen's face now. She let the bond hammer against the closed door she had held shut for 3 years, and she gave him the small, distant, courteous smile she used on men who wanted things from her, and inclined her head to precisely the depth protocol required for a visiting king of no greater rank than her own. "King Varek," she said, and her voice was cool and even, and carried the length of the hall. "The Ridgeback are welcome in the Highfells. It has been some time." She watched the words sometimes strike him and sink in. Watched him understand, slowly, with a dawning that was terrible to feel through the thread, that she meant to do this. All of it. The whole treaty, from first bell to last. As though they were strangers, with nothing between them but a charter waiting to be sealed. Watched him gather himself and decide, with an effort that cost him more than his face showed, to let her have it that way, because the alternative was to fall apart in front of 2 courts, and he was, whatever else he was, still a king. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice was not quite steady on it, and she hated, with a sudden fierceness that she noticed, that she still knew the exact sound of his voice when it was not steady. "The honor is the Ridgeback's entirely. Though I confess your summons surprised my whole council. We had not known, any of us, that the Highfells kept a queen of the old blood at all. The Highfells have always kept a great many things. The southern kingdoms found it more comfortable to forget." She rose, and the whole hall rose with her in a rustle of gray fur and pale steel, and she came down the shallow steps from the throne, because a queen, who clings to her high seat before a rival crown, looks afraid. You and your company will be weary from the passes. My steward will see you housed and fed. We begin the treaty in the morning, when everyone has slept. It should have ended there. She had built the whole encounter in her mind for weeks exactly so that it would end there. A cold, clean, formal first meeting, then 3 or 4 days of dry negotiation with a table safely between them. And then his company riding south again with their trade charter, and no notion whatsoever of anything that actually mattered. She had splinted the entire meeting in advance, the way you splint a break before it can set crooked. The great doors at the far end of the hall slammed open and shattered every careful bone of it. A steward came through them at a dead run, gray-faced and gasping, and behind him, 2 of her northern wardens came, half dragging, half carrying a third man between them, and the third man was bleeding from a wound Alira could smell from clear across the hall. The sharp, wrong, Swedish reek of a blade that had been dressed in something cunning to keep the torn flesh from ever closing. Her people, her border, her problem, queen or healer, it made no difference which. She was already moving down off the last step when the wounded warden forced the words out through his clenched and graying teeth. Raiders, your grace, the eastern passes, near the 3rd watchtower. But not raiders, not the usual ones. He gasped and gripped the steward's arm. They carried southern steel, ridgeback pattern, plain as day on the pommels, and they knew. Somehow they knew, you would have a ridgeback king sleeping under your own roof this very night. The whole vast hall went silent, and then every northern hand in it went to a hilt at once, and Alira felt the mood of the room swing toward the southern company like a cold wind changing quarter. Someone had wanted the Highfells and the Ridgeback at each other's throats on the exact night their 2 crowns first stood in a single room, and had used Varick's own pack pattern to light the fuse. And now, here, the 2 of them stood, bonded and estranged and suddenly lashed together by the same unseen hand, pulling on the same hidden rope. Varick stepped up close beside her under the rising snarl of the hall and pitched his voice low, meant only for her, the way he used to lean in over a duty roster 3 years and a lifetime ago. That blade work, he murmured. That poison on the steel. I have seen it before, Alira. Once, 3 years ago, in my own training yard, in the dark, on a bolt that missed my throat by the width of your hand. His pale eyes came to hers, and there was no charm left in them now. Nothing easy, nothing performed, only the grim, cold thing that lived underneath. Whoever tried to end us both under this roof tonight is the same hand that drove you out of my kingdom, and I think, Alira, that you have known who that is far longer than you have, let yourself say. A queen does not conduct her own private ruin in front of 200 armed northern lords with their blood already up. She gave 3 clear orders and a voice built to carry over weather. She had the wounded warden taken to her own still room, the southern company confined to the west wing for their safety, she said, and everyone's, and the great hall cleared to the walls. Only when the doors had boomed shut behind the last, curious lord did she turn to the work, because the work was the one place she had never once been afraid. Varick followed her down to the still room uninvited. She let him. Throwing him out would have meant admitting in front of her own wardens that she cared in the slightest where he stood, and she would not give him that or them. The wounded man was one of her best, a steady graybeard border warden named Osrin, who had taught her half of everything she knew about the northern passes in her first hard winter here, who had called her girl before he learned to call her your grace, and never quite broke the habit in private. He was dying. They both knew it the moment she cut the dressing away, and neither said the word aloud. She worked the sodden cloth back from the wound, and the smell of it bloomed up thick and sweet and wrong into the small warm room, and beside her she felt Varick go very still. You know that scent, she said. It was not a question. Wolfsbane, drawn down slow into an oil, and worked into the blade before it is ever drawn. His voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man reading his own old nightmares aloud. We lost 2 good men to it 3 years ago, and I never learned where it came from. It does not kill a wolf quickly. That is the cruelty of it. It holds a wound open, so a small cut bleeds a strong man out over a day and a night, and it locks the wolf so he cannot shift to heal. Whoever taught your raiders to dress a blade this way learned the craft in the south. Alira's hands did not pause or shake. She was packing the wound with the one paste she had ever found that slowed the bleeding. A thing of her own devising, she had spent a winter perfecting, and watched the flow, gentle under her fingers, buying the old man an hour, maybe 2. And she thought, with a cold, clear grief, about the 3 years it had taken her to learn to fight a poison that Varric had named correctly in a single breath. They had both been at war with the same hand this whole time, and neither had known the other was in the fight beside them. "Osrin," she said softly, close to his ear, "the men who did this to you, did any of them speak before the end?" The old warden's blind, bright eyes found her face, and fixed there, fond. "One did, girl. Your Grace." Before I put him down, his breath came ragged. He begged. At the last said it was never meant to come to open blades. Said he was promised the crown would fall on its own quiet and clean, if he only stirred the border a little and made it look like the Southerners. "A crown," he kept saying. He did not even know which crown he meant. He thought, poor young fool, that he served the North. Osrin's hand closed weakly around her wrist. He did not. Someone dressed a Southern plot in Northern colors and sent farm boys up the passes to die wearing them, and never told them whose war it was. And then the graybeard, who had taught her the mountains, let out a long, slow breath and did not draw another, and was gone, quietly, the way the North takes its own back into the cold. Alira sat back on her heels with his cooling blood drying dark on her hands and understood, fully and finally, that her enemy and Varric's enemy had always been the same single creature, wearing 2 kind faces in 2 distant kingdoms. She became aware slowly that she was not grieving alone. The bond she had held, walled for 3 years, was leaking his sorrow quietly into hers, steady and warm and unasked, and she understood that Varric had known Osrin for the length of a single evening and was mourning him anyway, wholly and honestly, simply and only because she was. She shut it hard, and stood, and washed the old man's blood from her clever hands in the cold basin. And when she spoke again, her voice was a queen's once more, planed, flat, and smooth. "You will have your treaty in the morning, King Varric. Trade, passage, and common cause against whoever has done all this. It seems we were always going to be allies, you and I. Someone has simply been very determined to prevent it, and has spent a great deal of blood in the preventing." She dried her hands, finger by finger, on the rough cloth. "That is all we are, though, allies. I would ask you to remember that, and to help me remember it, Alira." "Your Grace," she corrected him, very gently, and it was the cruelest thing she had said to any living soul in 3 years, and she watched it land in his face like a slow blade, and she made herself watch every moment of it, because a woman who cannot bear the cost of her own choices has no business making them in the first place. He inclined his head and did not fight her. He was, she thought, with an ache she despised, better than he had once been at accepting a door closed against him. 3 years had taught him that too. Then, but at the threshold he stopped, one hand on the cold frame, and without turning back to look at her, he said the one thing that quietly undid the whole careful evening she had built. "You closed it from the inside. That last night, in the keep, I felt you do it, felt your own hand on the door." His voice was very low. "For 3 years, I told myself that meant you had stopped feeling it, that the bond had died in you as clean as it went dark in me. I know better now. You cannot close a door that is not still hanging in its frame. You cannot bank a fire that has truly gone out. And then he was gone up the dark stair, and Elira stood alone in the warm still room with the dead man cooling behind her, and felt the thread in her chest glowing bright and traitorous and alive, and knew she had lied to him and to herself in the same breath, and that he had known it, and had chosen, out of some mercy she did not deserve, to let her keep the lie a little longer. The treaty was meant to take a single clean morning, and instead, it dragged on for 4 days, because a bleeding boarder does not stop bleeding for the convenience of 2 crowns. And every one of those 4 days put Varric in her council room, at her map table, at the far end of her own hall, close enough hour after hour that the bond ran warm as banked coals, whether she willed it or not. He was maddening. He was also infuriatingly useful. He knew the southern raiders' patterns, the way she knew the northern passes, and when they laid his knowledge beside hers over the great inked map of the Reach, the true shape of the thing began to show through the noise. The raids were not random. They followed a line. Every strike bled men and coin away from one western pass, the one old road that ran clean and quiet from the far north, straight down into the southern kingdoms, and every strike had been dressed to look like the fault of whichever crown it wounded. "Someone is not raiding your border at all," Varric said on the 3rd night. The 2 of them alone over the map long after the wardens had gone to their beds. "I have been reading it wrong all week, and so have you. Someone is clearing a road, north to south, straight through the heart of the Reach, past both our watches while both our watches look the wrong way. The raids are only noise. The road is the whole point." "A road? To what?" She leaned over the map beside him, close enough to feel the warmth off him, and did not let herself step back. "There is nothing at the north end of that pass but ice and my own capital. To you." He looked up at her across the guttering light. "To the old blood, Elira. Your own court told me the tale of your line this afternoon, believing you already knew every word. The line of Vasca did not simply fade from the world 4 generations ago. It was hunted, patiently across 2 generations, by a handful of great southern houses who could not abide the thought of a single strong crown uniting the north against them. And you did not know that, did you? You learned your own name off a dying stranger in a snowbound village, and never once learned why that name was worth so many lives to bury." She had not. She sat down slowly on the edge of the map table, and felt the old orphan's wound tear quietly open again, beneath the new queen's armor, and hated that it was him of all souls who had found the raw edge of it. "They kept me small on purpose," she said, before she had decided to say anything at all. "Someone made very sure I never learned to read the crest I was found wrapped in, told me it was a rag, kept me near, and grateful and nameless." Her voice cracked, and she despised the sound of it. "My whole life, I believed I was wanted for my hands, because being wanted for your hands is safe, and the other kind of wanting only ends one way. And now you tell me even that was a lie. I was not kept for my hands, I was kept for my blood, so it could be buried quietly and never trouble anyone." Varric came around the table to her. She did not move away, which was, she knew even as she failed to move, its own small defeat. "I wanted you for none of that," he said quietly. "Not your hands, not your blood, which I did not even know you had. I wanted a healer with mud on her hem and the only honest tongue in my kingdom, past all sense. I wanted the woman who called me an idiot about the grain tithe, and was right." He was close now, close enough that the bond fairly sang, and he lifted one hand and did not touch her, only let it hover a breath from the line of her jaw. 3 years I have carried you dark and silent inside my chest, and never once let the last coal go out. Tell me to stop, and I will seal your treaty in the morning, and ride south and never trouble your crown again. Or, open it. Just once, one single breath, on your terms, and then close it again, forever, if you wish. Open it, and know past all doubting, the way only a mate can know, that I am telling you the truth." She should have told him to stop, She had a queen's reasons ready, a full dozen of them, every one sound and sensible. Instead, she was tired past bearing, and grieving Osrin, and standing for the first time in 3 frozen years in the one warm current left in the world, and she reached up with a healer's steady hand and laid her palm, flat against his chest, over his heart, and opened the door she had held shut for 3 years. Just once, just a breath, it hit her like the north wind coming straight off the high peaks. Not desire, though that was in it too, something vaster and plainer and more dangerous. Grief and relief, and 3 years of devotion, spent on no one and under all of it, clear as struck crystal, the total absence of any guilt at all. There had never been another woman. There had never been. He had never, not for 1 hour, betrayed her. She felt the whole truth of it pour through with nothing left to strain it, and snatched her hand back as though the man were made of live coals. It was a lie, she whispered. All of it. The child, Severine, everything. It was never real. It collapsed within a single month, he said, gentle and terrible. There was no child. There was never going to be one. You were right in the hall that morning. The timing was flatly impossible, and you were the only soul in that room with the eyes to see it. You won, Elira. You unmade the whole thing simply by refusing to put your name to it. And then you vanished into the dark before you could learn that you had won. His jaw worked once. You ran from a victory. For 3 years the only thing I wanted was to find you and tell you that to your face. You were never driven out by the truth. You were driven out by a lie, and it worked, because whoever built it knew you would sooner believe in a heartbeat that you were unwanted than believe for 1 moment that you were loved. The last candle guttered. Somewhere far below in the sleeping keep a bell rang the late watch. And Elira, queen of the Highfells, last daughter of the old blood, stood in her own cold council room and felt 3 years of hard-won certainty come apart quietly in her hands like wet paper, and could not tell whether the thing rising in her chest was grief, or fury, or the first unwilling terrifying beginning of forgiveness. Then the council room door opened without a knock, and her steward stood in it, white as bleached bone, and said, "Your Grace, forgive me, forgive the hour, but you must come, and you must come now." The southern clerk, the sick one from the grain envoy. "We have found what he was carrying sewn into his coat, and your Grace, on my life, you must be the one to see it before another soul in this keep does." The clerk had come north a full 2 weeks ahead of Varek, riding quiet in the tail of the ordinary grain envoy that crossed the passes every spring to trade southern wheat for northern iron, and not one soul in the keep had marked his face, because a clerk and a grain envoy is the most invisible thing in any kingdom. He had taken a hard fever, 3 days past, and been carried to the infirmary, and there, in the grip of it, he had begun to rave, and a sharp-eared young novice had begun quietly writing down the things he raved, and now the steward had the novice's pages clutched in both hands, and his hands would not stop shaking. Elira read them, by guttering candlelight in the cold infirmary. Varek, a silent warmth at her shoulder. The clerk himself, gray and senseless on the cot with his shallow breath rattling. They were not the meaningless ravings of a fevered mind. They were, in their broken and circling way, a confession, the kind a man makes only when he believes himself already beyond consequence. Payments set down by the coin. Passes bribed open, wardens named and priced. A poison drawn down slow into an oil, and carried north, hidden in the false bottom of a physician's chest. And one name, written and underlined, and written again by a hand too far gone in fever to guard the tongue that drove it. The name of the master he had served all along. Halvard. But it was not the only thing the pages gave up. Near the end, where the novice's writing grew small and frightened, the clerk had raved about a second hand, a northern one, a key turned from the inside. Someone within these walls, he babbled. Someone trusted, who had opened a locked door for southern coin, and would open the last one when the hour came. Elora read the line 3 times and felt the cold come up through the floor and into her bones, because she did not yet know a name to put to it, and there were only so many souls in this keep who carried her trust and her keys. "He is not clearing a road to reach me," Elira said slowly, the pages trembling in her grip. "He has already cleared it. His man has been sitting inside my own kingdom for a fortnight, under my own roof, breathing my own air." She looked up, and the horror of it was arranging itself in her mind with a healer's cold precision. "Varik, your council begged you to ride north. My court sent the summons that drew you here. 2 kingdoms, 2 crowns, both moved across the board by the same patient hand to set us in one hall on one night, so that a border raid in southern steel would drop us both into a war that would end us together. He never wanted only one of us dead. He wanted us to do it to each other and take both our thrones down into the same grave." She stopped, because she had heard it under her own words, the one sound she had been trained since her first winter in this keep to hear in her sleep, and had let a single warm night in a council room make her deaf to. Below the infirmary, down in the dark of her own sleeping keep, a bell that had no business ringing at this black hour, not the watch bell, the gate bell, the formal one, 3 clear notes, and a pause, and 3 again. The exact sequence her wardens kept for an arrival of rank, in the dead middle of the night, that no living soul had cleared with her first. "He is here," she breathed, and her hand was already closing on the hilt of the knife at her belt. "He did not send his poison north, and then sit safe in the south, waiting for word of how it fell. He came. He came all this way himself, to stand in the cold and watch it done with his own eyes. Halvard is inside my walls." She was moving before Varik could get a word out, down the black spiral of the stair with the novice's pages still crushed in one fist, and she came out into the torchlit lower court in time to see them. The horses. The small, tight-mounted company in muffled southern gray, and the old man at the head of it, dismounting stiff and slow in the biting cold, that warm, familiar smile already fixed on his face. And she saw, in the same breath, standing at Halvard's stirrup with the reins in one gloved hand, leaning close to murmur into the old man's ear, and lifting the other hand to point directly up at the stair where Elira stood frozen. A face she knew. A northern face, one of her own, her captain of the household guard, the woman she had trusted 3 years with the keys to her own private chambers, bent low and easy at the ear of the man who had spent 30 patient years burying Elira alive, one kindness at a time. The captain glanced up and saw the queen standing rigid and white at the head of the stair, and every drop of blood went out of her face, and she stepped back sharp from the old man, with both her empty hands rising. "Your Grace," she said far too fast, "I can explain every part of this. It is not the thing you are standing there deciding it is." It was, of course, exactly the thing she was standing there deciding it was. That was the trouble with the words. No living soul had ever once said them about a thing that was innocent. But Elira had learned, in 3 hard years of holding a hard country, that the surest way to lose is to let your enemy watch the killing stroke draw back. So she did not draw the knife, she did not raise her voice or call her wardens down. She did not let a flicker of the cold fury reach her face. She stood at the head of the torchlit stair and looked down at her captain with an expression of dawning, wounded, trusting confusion, and let the woman believe, for one crucial breath, that the trap in the courtyard still had its jaws open. "Kestra," she said, soft and uncertain, using the captain's name the way you press on a wound to find the depth of it. "What is he doing here? Why is the Southern Chancellor standing in my own court in the middle of the night?" And Kestra, who was frightened half out of her wits, and cornered, and had plainly been promised a great many bright things by a very persuasive old man, did the thing frightened, cornered people always do. She reached for the story she had been handed. "He came to warn you, Your Grace, in secret, riding by night so the Ridgeback King would have no chance to silence him first. King Varric is not the man he shows you. The raids, the poison on the passes, all of it runs back to his hand and his coin. The Chancellor risked his own life crossing the winter passes to bring you the proof before that man could turn your own crown against your throat. She swallowed hard. Halvard has served your line his whole life without once asking your thanks. He came north to save you from the Southern King. There it was. The lie, laid out whole and gleaming in the torchlight. And, if Elira had still been the healer of 3 years past, wanted only for her hands and starving to belong somewhere, she might have wept to believe it. The kind old man, the secret, lifelong guardian, the dangerous king. It was a very good lie. It had been cut and fitted with enormous care, to exactly the shape of the frightened, grateful woman Halvard had spent 30 years shaping her to be. But that woman had died alone on a cold, black mountain road. 3 years gone, and the queen, who had grown up in her place, counted symptoms and weighed timelines for her living, and could not now unlearn the habit if she tried. He came all this way to warn me against Varric, Elira repeated slowly, turning it over as though genuinely working it through, and she let Halvard himself hear the doubt she painted into it, and watched him let the warm smile settle deeper, watched him let himself believe he had her. Because the poison, on my border, traces back to the Ridgeback. It does, your grace, I grieve to say it. Halvard came forward now into the torchlight, spreading his old empty hands, and, oh, she had missed that voice. That was the unbearable thing. She had genuinely missed the sound of it, and hating how much she had missed it was its own separate grief. I raised you from a foundling child. I bathed your fevers. I would sooner cut out my own tongue than lie to you. The wolfsbane oil is a southern craft. That much is true, but I hold letters, Elira. Letters in the king's own hand, ordering it, carried north into your passes. In the king's own hand, Elira nodded slowly, as if turning to face a hard truth. Ordering wolfsbane oil carried north. To murder my own border wardens in the snow. And you have held these letters in your possession. How long? Exactly. Guardian, some weeks now. I came the very moment I was certain of them. I could not risk being wrong and slandering a king. Some weeks. She smiled at him then, and she did not yet know, though half her court would swear to it after, that it was her dead mother's smile to the life, the smile of the old blood arriving at the edge of its long patience. Halvard. My warden Osrin died 2 nights ago of that very oil, with his blood on my hands. Your man, the clerk, who carried the poison north in a false-bottomed chest, has lain raving in my infirmary for 3 days, and named his master with his own dying tongue. And the name, he cried, was not the king of the Ridgeback. You have brought me letters that took some weeks to reach me, to warn me against a poison that has sat inside my walls for a fortnight, carried by your own servant, to kill my own people. Also, you might light a war between 2 crowns you arranged to stand in one hall on one night. You did not cross the passes to save me from Varric. Her voice did not rise. You crossed them because your raid failed, and your poison failed, and your clerk lay dying with your name in his mouth, and you had exactly 1 lie left. So you rode a fortnight through the cold to sell it to me in person. Because in 30 years, you learned one thing about me you were certain of, that I would believe you, over my own wardens, over the evidence of my own 2 eyes. As I did, gratefully, for 30 years. The warm smile did not fall from Halvard's face so much as freeze upon it, the way still water freezes when the true cold finally comes down off the mountain. You forget yourself, girl, he said, very quietly, and the warmth went out of his voice at last, all of it, every drop of 30 years of it gone between one breath and the next, and what stood revealed underneath was the thing she should by rights have feared her whole life. You forget what you are, a cot-born foundling. I lifted out of the muck with these 2 hands, and could set back down in it tomorrow, with a single word in the right ear. There is not one soul in all the South who would follow the last daughter of a hunted and forgotten line, and there is not one soul in this frozen north who loves you enough to lift a blade and die for you. You are a costume, child. You always were. I dressed you in a healer's gray and you believed in it, with your whole heart. Now, some fool has dressed you in a crown, and you have gone and believed in that too. You are right, Elira said. About one thing. For 30 years I believed in every costume you ever put on me. The grateful orphan, the quiet healer, the plain useful girl who was only ever wanted for her hands, and who would surely have the grace to remove herself the moment she became inconvenient, and save you the mess of the knife. She came down off the last step into the torchlight, and the light ran along the pale gold circlet on her brow, along the worked pattern in it that Varric had half known and could not place, the sigil of the line of Vasca, worn by no living woman since her grandmother was put to the sword in the last of the Southern Wars. I heard you say that, guardian. I stood in the dark of your corridor the night before. You sprang your lie, and I heard you say it to Severine through a door left ajar. I have carried the words next to my heart for 3 years. The way I carried the crest you told me was a rag. The healer will remove herself. It is the one useful thing about girls like that. She watched the words land in him. Watched Hallvard understand, for the first time in 30 years, that she had not fled his keep 3 winters ago in blind and broken grief at all. That she had fled because she had heard him with her own ears. That the frightened, grateful girl he was, so certain he had shaped and broken and could break again, had been, even on that first black night, already one full step ahead of his knife. So, allow me to remove myself one last time, she said. Out of the very last costume you ever cut for me, the one where I am too small and too nameless and too unloved for a single soul in the world to follow. She raised her voice then, and now it did carry, out across the whole torchlit court, up the pale stone walls, out into the black and waiting dark beyond the gate. Wardens of the Highfells. To me, they came out of the dark, out of the shadow under the gate arch, out from behind the stables, down off the walls, where they had stood silent and unseen the whole while, because a queen who holds a hard country does not walk down into her own lower court at midnight to meet an unannounced company of southern riders. Northern spears, a whole bristling ring of them, closing quiet and certain around the southern company, and the old man, frozen at the heart of it. Kestra, the captain looked wildly around at the closing ring and understood at last, far too late, which way the trap had truly faced, and dropped to both knees on the cold stone without waiting to be told. You said no soul in this north knows me well enough to die for me, Elira said, walking toward the old man through the ring of her own spears. You were wrong, Hallvard. You were wrong about the one thing you were always surest of. You spent 30 patient years teaching me. I was wanted only for my use, and gods, you taught it well. But a blind, dying woman in a snowbound village laid her thumb on the crest sewn into my cloak and spent her last breath giving me back my own name. And these wardens do not follow me for my blood, which most of them cannot even read, and not for my use. They follow me because I have set their bones with these hands and closed their wounds and stood the frozen passes at their sides, through weather that would kill any soft southern lord. And because when it was hard, I stayed. That is the thing you never understood about being wanted, old man. You cannot arrange it. You can only earn it by staying, and you never once tried. She gave the smallest nod to her wardens, and they took him. They took his muffled company, and they took the weeping captain, who had sold her queen's own keys for an old man's warm and worthless promises, and it was all done, in the end, quietly and without a single blade drawn, the way a hard country settles its hardest accounts. Only when the court had emptied and gone, still did she turn and find Varec. He had stood the whole while at the foot of the black stair, exactly where she left him, having drawn no weapon and spoken no word, having simply watched and let her take back her own kingdom with her own two hands. His face, when she made herself look at it full, was doing something that hurt to look at, some helpless tangle of pride and grief, and a raw, unguarded hope he was vainly trying not to let her see. "You did not need me," he said, low and wondering, "for any part of it. You never needed me at all, did you?" "No," she agreed quietly. "I did not. That, Varek, is rather the whole point of it." She was suddenly exhausted, the 3 years heavy across her shoulders, the bond glowing wide open, and she no longer had the strength to hold the door against it. "I spent my whole life belonging to people, because they found me useful, or because I found them safe. I built this crown, this whole cold, hard country, precisely so I would never again have to be wanted for a reason. So hear me clearly. I do not need you. My border is my own. My name is my own. My people are my own, and they are enough. If I let you back through this door," she pressed a hand flat to her chest over the singing thread, "it will not be because I have nowhere else to stand. It will be because I choose to, from a throne, with everything to lose by it. Which is the only way I have ever wished to be wanted, and never yet been. Then choose it," he said, and his voice had gone rough. "Tell me the price of it. Whatever it is, name it. And it is already yours. I do not care in the slightest what it costs me." And Alira, who had learned 3 years ago exactly, and to the copper what a crown can cost a person, looked at the young king, who had crossed 4 kingdoms and 3 years for no better reason than to stand in her cold court and tell her that she had won, and she knew, with perfect clarity, precisely what to ask of him. "3 years ago," she said, "I closed a door in your chest and went down a mountain, alone, in the dark, and I never let you speak a word, because I was certain that if I let you speak, I would believe you, and believing you was the one thing I knew I could not survive. I took the choice clean out of your hands. I decided your whole heart for you and left before you could argue it. It was the cruelest thing I have ever done, and I did it to save myself, and I have never once been sorry, because it kept me alive long enough to grow into all of this." She looked at him, level and unflinching. "So here is your price, Vodek of the Ridgeback. I will not have you the way you had me for 2 years in your keep, in secret, at odd hours, in a healing hall below the notice of your court. A king's healer, he loved and would not name, because his high houses would never stomach a nameless girl on the Luna's seat. I spent my whole life being the thing people kept quietly, off to the side, useful and unclaimed. I will not do it again, not for anyone, not even for you." His face had gone very still in the torchlight. "Then, what would you have of me?" "Go home," she said. "Ride south, back to your black iron seat, and your grand council, and your high houses in all their winter furs, the very ones who sat and murmured with such relief on the morning a comfortable lie was more welcome to them than I ever was. And tell them, every last one of them, in your own great hall, in broad daylight, with your whole court gathered to hear you say it, that the Alpha King of the Ridgeback asks leave to treat for the hand of the Queen of the Highfells, as an equal, before all his people, and let them murmur all they like, and do it anyway. Stake your crown on wanting me out loud, in the one room where wanting me out loud will cost you something dear. You asked me the price, Varric. That is the whole of it, not a jewel, not a war. Only the one thing you never gave me, when the giving of it was easy, say my name, where it is dangerous, to say it." For a long moment he did not move at all, and she thought with a strange cold calm that she had asked too much, that no king alive could humble his own crown before his own court for a foreign queen and hope to keep his high houses after, that she had built him a wall he could not pay to climb, and that some cowardly corner of her own heart had perhaps built it that high on purpose, so she would never have to risk the fall. Then Varric began, quietly, standing in the middle of her cold torchlit court, to laugh. And it was not a bitter sound at all, it was the helpless, delighted, disbelieving laugh of a man, handed the key to a thing he has carried locked and heavy for far too long. "You want me to do the reckless thing," he said, wonder plain in his voice. "The mad thing. The thing that can never be taken back, in front of everyone I rule, knowing full well it may cost me the whole of it." He shook his head slowly. "Do you know, in 3 years, not one soul has ever once asked me to be brave about you. Only careful. Everyone is forever so very careful. And here you stand asking me, at last, to be a fool in daylight." He crossed the last of the cold stone between them, and this time she did not step back, and this time he did touch her, one warm hand curving at the line of her jaw, exactly the way it used to in the gray hour. And the bond ran gold and wide and unguarded between them at last, with nothing left to strain it through. "I will do it. I will do far worse than it. I will do it twice over, in 2 courts. If the first time is not humiliating enough to satisfy you, once will do the thing," she said. "It will not," he said. "You are worth 3 humiliations at the very least, and I have every intention of being thorough about the count." It took him the better part of a year. He rode south and did exactly the thing she had asked, in his own great hall, in broad daylight, with his whole court gathered to hear it, and the high houses murmured, and a good many did a great deal worse than murmur, and he stood in the middle of it and weathered every word, and did not once look away. And then he wrote to her, every week of that long, cold year, in his own hand, letters short and long, and a great many not about her at all, a border dispute, a grain tithe, as though her blunt answer to a dull question of state were still the thing he wanted most in the world. He rode north, through the spring passes, to court her openly, at her own high table, until her grinning wardens began laying wagers on the day she would relent. He asked her badly, and beautifully, and once with so many northern winter roses that her still room smelled like a wedding, a full fortnight before there was one. And every time, she told him, gently, to ask again, tomorrow. Until one perfectly ordinary morning, over cold tea and an unrolled border map, with no roses and no court and no grand words at all, she looked up at the man who had crossed 4 kingdoms and humbled his own crown and spent a whole long year proving past all doubt that he meant every word of it, and she said yes. Both courts came to see it done. The black iron and the pale gold, southern firs and northern spears, crowded together into one hall, and if a fair number of them had come only to see whether the mad thing would truly happen, they stayed for the rest of it just the same. He cried, during the vows. She had known that he would. She did not quite, though it was a very near thing at the end, and the bond gave her away regardless, wide open now and glowing bright for anyone in either court, with the wit to feel it, and he laughed at her softly through his own tears. "You are stuck with me now," he murmured when it was done, his forehead resting against hers, the 2 crowns leaned quietly together, in front of everyone, in broad daylight, in 2 courts at once. "There is no taking it back now." "Why on earth would I take it back?" Illyra said. "I am the one who set the price. If you will trouble yourself to recall, you only paid it, and took your time about the paying. Best coin I ever spent in my life." He kissed her, and both the halls roared their approval to the pale stone rafters, and the old blood feud between the 2 great mountains ended not in fire, and not in blood, but in a plain, quiet morning, yes, over cold tea, which is a far rarer and far harder thing to come by than any war. And if you had reminded her on that day of the wry old saying she had once believed with her whole bitter heart, that the entire ruin of her life had been the king's fault, every last piece of it, she would have told you the honest truth of the matter. It was never his fault, and it was never hers. It was the fault, first and last, of a kind old man who taught a frightened orphan girl that she could only ever be wanted for her use, and was so very good at the teaching that he never dreamed the lesson might one day be the death of him. And the great joke of the whole thing, the one she got to laugh at quietly for the rest of a long and well-loved life, was this. That in the end, it was the old man who died alone and forgotten in the dark, and the nameless, unwanted healer who walked out of it all with her own name, her own crown, her own people, and a king who wept to say that name in daylight.